Hello, everyone, and welcome to 0 Degrees of Separation, the Role of the Social Determinants. My name is Jason Jones, and I'm a social worker here at the Community Technical Assistance Center of New York and at the McSilver Institute for Poverty Policy and Research at NYU Silver. We're so glad to have you here with us today to join us for our second offering of this series, Women and Mental Health, Embracing the Intersections of Trauma, Oppression, and Agency. So I want to thank everyone for joining us, and I want to just get started. So we're going to have Dr. Maiwa Obasaju introduce herself as well as take it away.
Hello, everyone, and I just want to echo my thanks for you participating in this webinar. As Jason said, my name is Dr. Maiwa Obasaju, and I'm a community and clinical psychologist, and I'm a trauma and healing-focused staff psychologist at the Furman Counseling Center of Barnard College, which is a part of Columbia University. I also engage in consultation, training, and educating. And I'm a licensed New York psychologist. So those are my professional credentials. But I'm also someone who's completely fascinated with why people do what they do from a systemic point of view. And so I hope to have a conversation with you about what informs my framework around working with clients, predominantly young women at a college counseling center. So what we'll do today is I'm going to go over some relevant terms that I'll be utilizing throughout the presentation, just so we have a basic common understanding of the language that I'll be using. And then I'll be moving forward to make some connections between trauma, poverty, and mental health difficulties in women. And I will be utilizing a case example to exemplify a way to embrace the intersections of trauma, oppression, and agency. And then at the end have some time for some Q&A. Before we get going, I wanted to kind of have a content warning and basically to say I'm going to be talking about multiple issues that may or may not produce different reactions in people. And I know we do content warnings particularly around sexual violence and physical violence, which will be mentioned in this conversation, but not gone into great detail. But I also want to acknowledge that other experiences may serve as triggers, and that there's no one experience that is a trigger for everyone. So talking about oppression, talking about race-based trauma, or sexual identity-based trauma might produce reactions in different people. And I'm just asking people to be okay with being uncomfortable, but to also do whatever you need to do to take care of yourself. So I want to start off with a basic definition of trauma. When we talk about trauma, we can go through lists and lists of what might constitute trauma. At the bottom of this page, you can see some experiences like childhood abuse and neglect, war, medical interventions, grief, loss, and we can go on and on with events that may be traumatic, but something isn't traumatic because it's on this list or on another list. It's traumatic because it's traumatic for that person, because it overwhelms their internal and I would say external resources that give people a sense of control, connection, and meaning. And the trauma response can be impacted by personal histories, family dynamics, community values, resources, norms, social identities and locations, and also the social, political, and economic realities that people exist in. And the last two, social identities and locations and social, political, and economic realities, are the areas that I want to expand on in this presentation. And so, unfortunately, for many people, an aspect of their social, political, and economic reality is the experience of oppression. And what is oppression? So for me, I'm using Young's framework for oppression. I'm not going to be able to go into as much detail as I would like. I've spent classes just teaching this, but I want it to be a reference point for us to understand oppression as attitudes, behaviors, and pervasive systemic social arrangements whereby oppressed groups are culturally dominated, so we can think of cultural appropriation, exploited, often for labor, marginalized, often not given the same rights as other people, denied power and voice, and can be targets of violence. And a word on oppression, in as much as oppression definitively exists, resistance to oppression is also always present. I always want to name that. So another term that I'll be using quite often during this presentation is that of privilege. There are a lot of definitions of privilege and a lot of different viewpoints, but the one I'll be using is understanding privilege as a societally granted benefit to people based on their identity or their social group membership. And it allows people to have power over others, and it's an often unearned privilege that people have. So for example, privilege can be both at the kind of micro level and the macro level. So when we're thinking of heterosexual privilege, it's thinking of how for many people in heterosexual relationships, they don't have to think twice about walking down the street holding hands with their partner. They don't have to worry or fear being the target of threat or violence. Or if you think of class privilege, if you're middle and upper class, you do have the privilege of having politicians fight for your vote and pay attention to your needs and desires. And oftentimes when we're in conversations, especially clinical conversations, people, clinicians, and clients tend to focus more on their privilege, less on their privileges, especially if you have identities that are oppressed. In many ways, we're trained to go for pain, and so much of oppression comes with pain. At the same time, privilege comes with its own complexities that can impact the therapeutic process. So when we see clients, how often do we explore their privilege, and how often do we name it as such? So I want to go back to this idea of social identities and how we have identities that answer this question of who am I? And sometimes they're individual or family-based, but they're often part of group membership. And so we talk about race, we talk about gender or sexuality or religion or disability, but we often talk about them as separate identities. We don't necessarily talk about them as simultaneously experienced identities. But we do have a history of people who have done such. And I like quoting the Combahee River Collective, a group from the 70s, predominantly queer women of color, who looked at the kind of racial justice movements and said some of our experiences are missing. They looked at the sexual identity justice movements and said some of our identities and movements and said we find it are missing. We find it difficult to separate race from class from sex oppression because in our lives they're most often experienced simultaneously. And Kimberly Crenshaw in Legal and Critical Race Theories coined the term intersectionality, and Patricia Hill Collins popularized this term. It was also expressed by Angela Davis and other feminist and critical race theorists. And so what the term intersectionality is trying to point out is that we have multiple social identities and locations, and they intersect both at the individual, community, and institutional levels. And they are not just identities that we hold, but they reflect broader interlocking systems of oppression and privilege. And these identities are not additive or multiplicative, but simultaneous. So I speak to you as someone who is Black, who was born in another country, who is woman, who is a psychologist, and I can't speak to you from any one of these identities. I speak to you from all of those identities, simultaneously operating in a way that, for example, led me to present on this very particular topic. And so with those identities, I simultaneously hold privilege in some of them and oppression in others. And it's by understanding the intersection of both of those of experiences of oppression and privilege that I'm able, that I have a lens through which I see the world and I operate in the world and I interact with others and institutions. So one example I like to give about understanding intersectionality is that there's a commonly held quote about how women make 79 cents on the dollar to men. Yet, if you explore that a little bit deeper, that quote is for white women. African American women make 64% on the dollar. Hispanic or Latino women make 54%, 65% for Pacific Islanders, 59% for American Indians, and 90% for Asian women. So it's by understanding the intersections that we get a better snapshot, a more complex and comprehensive snapshot of an individual's experience. And so part of what intersectionality asks is that we don't just look at individual level factors and kind of say, what is your gender? we also interrogate the systemic aspects. We add power to the conversation. So it's not just about gender, it's also about sexism and cissexism. It's not just about race, it's about racism, and so on and so forth. And so then when we take our understandings of intersectionality and we take our understandings of trauma, when we connect power, privilege, and oppression, we can name how oppression exists in various forms and across many levels, and that different forms of oppression interact and shape an individual's sense of power, resilience, and well-being, which is salient for the therapeutic endeavor, and that there are advantages and disadvantages in the distribution of social resources that affect individuals' mental health and well-being. Access to resources for healing is directly connected to your resources, social and economic. And the effects of trauma can accumulate over time and interact with other life experiences. And so not only do we want intersectionality in our understanding of individuals, we also want intersectionality in our understanding of how people are impacted by multiple layers of experience. In addition, intersectionality helps us understand trauma in a different way. So if you think about social identities, then we can understand that for some people are targeted for experiences of trauma based on their social identities. Unfortunately, we have statistics that tell us that trans women, people of color, and gay men face the highest risk of homicide in the nation, according to the National Report on Hate Violence Against Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgender and Queer People. And part of that is people being targeted for not fitting into a gender binary, not that they need to, but other people are targeting them because of their identities and who they are as people. There's also a differential impact on trauma based on social identities. Class is one that usually comes to mind. People have different accesses to resources that impact how they experience trauma and how they get help from it. It also can impact disclosure concerns and experiences. So, for example, if you think about someone who's grown up in a family and a community that highly prizes virginity based on religious reasons, then disclosure concerns have a whole new context, and seeking help has a whole new context. In addition, help and treatment that people receive is impacted. There have been a number of recent research that show medical professionals view Black and African American people as experiencing less pain. So now think about it, unfortunately experiencing a sexual assault and going in for a forensic exam with a healthcare provider who doesn't think that you experience pain to the same degree as other people do, and how that then impacts your trauma. It also impacts how people respond to their experiences and impacts clinical biases, beliefs, and roles. So if two people came in naming the exact same trauma but had different racial or ethnic backgrounds, do we treat them differently? Do we make different assumptions about their family, their resources, their ability to cope? And intersectionality asks us as clinicians to really interrogate that. So one area that I do want to delve a little bit more deeply into, considering the topic of these conversations, is that of poverty. I'm going to be giving statistics, which I know sometimes can lose people. I don't want to do that because all of these statistics have human beings behind them. And I'm not going to go into as much depth as I would like, but I do want to have go over these slides as a reference for people to understand when we're talking about oppression, trauma, poverty, and women, what we're talking about. So if we look at the median household in the United States in 2014 as $53,657, and then we look at what's defined as poverty. So in 2014, poverty was $24,000 for a family of 4 with 2 children. And I'd like people to take a moment and pause and think about what that means. Think about how much money you make, and this number might fit your life, but it also might not. Think about how much money you make. Think about who's dependent on you, and think about $24,000. And so that's poverty. So someone making $25,000 wouldn't even be in this statistic, or someone making $30,000 for 4 people. So we're thinking about 14.8% of the population, 46.7 million, meet this statistic. But when we break that down by race, ethnicity, and gender, we see different. We see the intersection. When we break that down further, and we look at female-headed households with children, the numbers of people in poverty increase exponentially. So we can't just look at poverty rates in general. We need to break down who we're talking about. If we identify women living with disabilities between 16 and 34, we also find higher rates of poverty. And so what this is telling us is that the intersectionality of multiple forms of oppression has been found to increase the complexity of experience and recovery from trauma. And so who are we talking about? Women in poverty have high rates of exposure to trauma and cumulative adversity, and which increases their risk for a range of mental health difficulties. And young women, women of color, single mothers, and women with disabilities are overrepresented in poverty statistics. Yet at the same time, if we look at a lot of our research in a multitude of clinical spaces, are these the folks that we're paying attention to? Are these the folks that we're sitting with and exploring their stories and their narratives, and how also they resist and overcome? Or are we only pathologizing them if we pay attention to them at all? So I feel like this is one of the reasons why we need to understand intersectionality in our clinical work and utilize frameworks that allows for the complexity and comprehensiveness of people's experiences as we want to do helping work. And so I like using this quote as an introduction to the case example that I'm going to be using to explain how I utilize a framework. So we exist on multiple levels, and such multiple identities allow for us to have multiple sites of oppression that also add privilege. However, oppression itself serves a purpose in terms of power. Even outside the aggressive acts that both individuals and states perpetrate, there are the small, everyday actions that multiply to form a layer of weight upon the lives of those caught in the margins, whose lives and identities exist outside of the mode of white, heteronormative, able-bodied, and we can continue, middle, upper class folks. And this is where the idea of intersectionality is useful. And so I want to talk to you about Aaliyah. Aaliyah is someone who I've been incredibly fortunate to know and meet and learn from the past 3 years. I give you her identifiers, but also want to say that these identifiers can't speak to the complexity of who she is and how she approaches the world, which has taught me so much. She's a 19-year-old Black, Jamaican Trinidadian, and Chinese, born and resides in the United States, documented, currently able-bodied, diagnosed with generalized anxiety and PTSD, identifies as spiritual but not religious. She's partnered with a male. Her family has historically fluctuated between poverty levels and lower working class levels. And she's a second year at the time of the case. First generation, cisgender, female college student. The first time I met Aaliyah was when I was co-facilitating a Women of Color support group on our campus. And it was one of our first groups in early October, and she was a first-year student. And we were talking about why there was a need for such a group in the first place. And I remember her saying, "This institution wasn't made for me." And I remember how striking that was for me, because it was the truth in many ways that I had not had an 18-year-old say so succinctly to me, and then be able to go on and continue as to why this institution wasn't made for her, the history of it, but why she was there anyway, and what she wanted to claim from this institution that she knew that was fundamentally not necessarily there for her betterment or for her in her multiple identities. So about a year later, she comes in to see me in the Counseling Center for Individual Therapy. Our counseling center is a short-term based counseling center where it's free of charge and students can come in for approximately 8 sessions. And she came in and said that part of the reason she was coming in was because she recently experienced a sexual assault in college. It wasn't by her partner. And she also alluded to physical violence when growing up, and that the sexual assault was making it hard for her to cope with a lot of things, predominantly her classwork, and she was having a hard time focusing. In addition, she talked about relationship struggles with her mother, and she described how her mother had chronic and long-standing mental, physical, and cognitive difficulties and diagnoses all through Aaliyah's life, and that in many ways Aaliyah was functioning as the primary caretaker in her family, mediating relationships between her mother and her grandmother, her mother and her father, who was still in the picture but no longer in a relationship with her mother, and how she was taking care of her two younger sisters, not just emotionally, but also with money that she was making via work study. And then in addition to all of this, she also very much saw herself as a social justice advocate who participated in on-campus demonstrations. And one thing I just want to clarify is when I said first generation, I meant first generation college student. So part of her social justice advocacy was participating in on-campus demonstrations, particularly around Black Lives Matter movement, but was also identifying the many ways in which the campus organizing was intersecting with some of her experiences of physical and sexual trauma, and was producing a lot of fear in her and anxiety. And so with all of this fear and anxiety, she was also struggling with intense feelings of anger, shame, and guilt surrounding the intersections of race, gender, and class. So for example, in her classes as a biracial, multiracial, she would fluctuate between the terms person, she often very much identified as Black, but didn't see herself as a Black multiracial person being reflected in classes. She was an Africana studies major. When it came to class, as someone from a lower SES, she would struggle with how often the conversations were both about middle-class Black people and used language that wasn't accessible to people in her life, and what it meant that she was also internalizing some of this language while at the same time fighting it back. And she also felt that she experienced a lot of gender oppression in the context of organizing, where as a young woman she was asked to engage in a lot of work, but didn't see people as giving her and other young women in the organizing a lot of power, especially as spokespeople. And that sometimes some of the actions that people wanted to have the group take part in felt dangerous, especially based on gender. So she had all of these areas of focus that she wanted to explore. And some of the statements, since I can't have her speak, that I just wanted to name that very much influenced our work, were her initially saying, I can't even deal with the sexual assault right now. There's so much else happening in my life. She also talked about how every professional blamed my mother, even though she did the best that she could, and how it made that really hard for her to talk and name the struggles that she was having with her mother, because she felt shame, like she was colluding with these professionals who had no idea the struggles that her mother went through, both in around class, race, and disability. Then, of course, this institution was not made for me, and I believe that this institution tried to kill me. And I want to speak about that because it's very much related to her on-campus activism. So students decided that in response to a number of non-indictments in New York City of the police against Black people who were killed, that they were going to stage a die-in on the college campus. So it was going to be late at night, and they were going to lie on the ground, about dozens of students, and do a die-in to draw attention to what was happening and to the silence around the institution. Also, people had been putting Black Lives Matter posters around the different institutions, and people had been tearing them down or writing All Lives Matter, and they wanted to take a stand. And so somebody at the institution decided in response to this demonstration where they were quietly lying down to call NYPD. And so NYPD was called, and for some reason, we're still not 100% sure, they came in full SWAT gear. And so we had students lying on the ground to protest non-indictments by NYPD and looking up and seeing officers in full SWAT gear standing over them. And at a debrief later on a student said, "I believe that this institution tried to kill me with that action." And that was so salient for so many of the other students in the room, including Aaliyah. So we have all of this as for context, and we also have to deal with the realities of this being a short-term counseling relationship, which I talked to students about from the beginning, but I also have to introduce potential long-term concerns at the beginning. And her pushback was she wanted a Black woman therapist who understood class dynamics and wouldn't blame her mother for the difficulties that she experienced in parenting, but she also had an insurance that very few people took in New York. And she was also struggling with knowing that this would be another transition. So all of this was part of the dynamic of our work together. How was our work together going to go, and how was her own work with other people going to go afterwards? So I want to talk about some of the frameworks I used in approaching how I understood and worked with Aaliyah. And one of the frameworks is the addressing model by Hayes. And it's, I think, a very helpful acronym for keeping in mind different social identities that might or might not be salient to people that you're working with. And I use it in our intake. We have a very structured intake, but when it comes to things like social relationships and family history, this is where I ask some of these questions. And I ask not only for people to identify kind of what they are in regards to age or nationality or socioeconomic class, but what are the meanings that they associate with it, and how salient is it for them, and in what context is it salient for them. So, for example, Aaliyah didn't really think about her heterosexual status in classes, in her classrooms. That's where for her gender and her race, but particularly her class were most salient. She didn't necessarily think about her religious status with her friends, but she did when it came with her family because they were more religious and she was more spiritual. So it was also asking about what are the contexts in which different identities are important, and also what are the values associated with those identities. Where did she learn about ideas around ethnicity or about race? Where did she learn, or what were the messages that she's taken in about ability and disability? And then kind of my go-to model as to how I approach working with people is Bronson-Brenner's socio-ecological framework. And I'll show an image of it. But Bronson-Brenner said that individuals are nested within larger units of relationship with time and historical moments serving as impact. And I use this during my intake with people. I'll say, so I know you're coming in for example, trauma-related difficulties, but I understand individuals as being part of broader systems. Those systems can include your relationships with your family, it can include your relationships with this institution, but it can also include your relationships with American values and cultures and understandings that media and pop culture also serve as part of the things that impact you. And to whatever extent that you feel it's relevant, I'd like for you to feel free to bring in those relationships, because I'll also be asking about them. And the thing about Bronson-Brenner that I appreciate is that it's a bidirectional relationship. So it's not only about how these broader systems impact you as an individual, it's about how you impact these systems, which I thought particularly was helpful with somebody who saw themselves as a social change agent. And I also definitively use theories and approaches from critical race theory and feminist theories. And so here's a better or a different example of Bronson-Brenner. And so for Aaliyah, I would just kind of briefly say, we look at the individual. I look at her as a young woman who is in college, who's struggling with all of these different current and historical issues, who's incredibly intelligent, very bright, always having questions, but she's part of a microsystem that involves this particular elite institution, that involves the places that she's working on and off campus, that involves her family. But she's also part of exosystems. And so those are the indirect environments that impact her that she's not necessarily a part of. So when we think about government, we think about financial aid and how she was on scholarships, government scholarships. And so when she was experiencing intense anxiety and pain and was thinking about wanting to leave school, she had to navigate whether if she took a semester off, that would negatively impact her financial aid and get in the way of her graduation. These economic systems and government systems have a direct impact. And the mesosystem is the relationship between the two, like the relationship between the school and financial aid. And then we have the macro system across all of that, the norms and values of the culture. And for her, that was multiple cultures. That was the quote-unquote American culture. It was her Trinidadian and Jamaican cultures. It was also her Chinese cultures. And how were all of those values also impacting how she operated in the world? And what I also appreciate is that there's this chronosystem, so time and historic influences. What does it mean to be in the time of social media? What does it, most of social media, what did it mean for her to be in the time of Black Lives Matter and how that impacted the campus? And so what did that mean for me as a clinician when I approached working with her? I couldn't just look at her as an individual with individual level characteristics. She wouldn't have accepted that, and I didn't think it would be helpful to begin with. And so thinking about Bronfenbrenner, thinking about the addressing model, throughout our work, but from the beginning, I assessed what her relationships were to all of these different areas in her life and had to keep them in mind throughout our work together. In addition, I very much wanted to use trauma-informed approaches. We talked through whether she was ready to go into the details and the experience of her sexual assault at this time. And through our conversation and through but through valuing her agency and her empowerment and her ability to have her own voice, we decided to not go into the details of the assault at this time, but to work to some degree on the impacts of it. So the anxiety that she was experiencing, the different ways that she was triggered, the different ways that she felt disconnected from herself and from other people, and issues of safety. And so part of what helped influence my thought process is how to incorporate trauma-informed approaches, which is from SAMHSA. And so some of the things that had to be present for me were questions about safety, her safety in different spaces. Also, how was I functioning as a trustworthy person, and how were different institutions functioning as trustworthy or not trustworthy for her. And transparency was huge for me. I talked through with her kind of why I was doing what I was doing, what my approach was, and why every single time. But I also very much valued that she existed outside of our therapeutic room, and so talked with her about where were the different spaces of support from peers that she already had or maybe wanted to create. And collaboration and mutuality also looked like getting her permission to talk to the different spaces that she was working on campus in order for us to work together to help her have better experiences and for them to also understand why certain things might be difficult for her. In addition, we talked about empowerment, voice, and choice, and then, yes, cultural, historical, and social identity-related issues. I'm going to talk a little bit more about how I incorporated some historical and intergenerational trauma in some of my specific approaches. So, and I just wanted to, this is small, so I'll read out some of the questions. It's from the Learning Network, and they were talking about how to use intersectionality in asking questions about social identity and trauma. And so some examples are, how do people in your life talk about violence in relationships? What do they say about violence against women or people? Are there messages about violence in your group, in the groups that you belong to, different from your understanding of violence? And that was definitively a huge part for her. So once again, even though we didn't go into the details about the trauma, we did talk about the impact and what was impacting her. So for example, she felt like she couldn't actually talk or disclose her experiences of sexual violence in specific to people in her life, including her mother and her grandmother, because, and I'll say this later, we used the genogram, and she disclosed that actually multiple women in her life had experienced sexual violence, and it had almost become normalized as an experience, a horrific one, but one that was a common one, And in the context of needing to very much worry about paying rent, that wasn't something that could be kind of salient in the conversations, and in some ways was minimized and dismissed. Yet at the exact same time, we had a conversation about why she thought and what were her experiences of this being a generational trauma, and what were some of the factors in American culture, but also in Trinidad and Jamaica and China that impacted generational trauma. And she was in more contact with her Trinidadian and Jamaican side from her mother's side. And so that was a lot of where values were communicated through for her. You know, even questions like you mentioned that being from a lower class background had an impact on what you've been through. Tell me more about that. And so really naming and bringing in these experiences into the clinical room and not necessarily always having the student have to bring it up. And questions like, are there other pieces about your life or personal story that have made it hard to talk about what you've been through? What were they? What were parts of your life that actually have made it easier for you to talk to? So being in organizing spaces, she actually found a subset of people who had experienced different forms of violence who made it easier for her to talk about her experiences with violence with them. She found them to be, in that way, a very supportive community. And then one that I think is very valuable, are there any specific traditions, practices, or resources that are important to your healing? And this is also when we talk about people's power. Where do they draw it from, and how can they utilize it in the therapeutic space? And then also being able to incorporate issues of oppression and privilege. And so I'm not going to be able to go into as much detail as I'd like around these 4 areas, but I do want to name that oftentimes when we talk about oppression and privilege in clinical spaces and even in our research, we talk about it at the interpersonal and internalized levels. So even in kind of eating disorders research, we can talk about how you internalize societal messages about ideal body shape, and we talk about microaggressions. So interpersonally, how have you experienced oppression? But oftentimes we leave out the ideological. And oppression, the ideology under oppression is that one group, a dominant group, is better than others and has the right to control other groups. And that this group that can control another group is more intelligent, more deserving, more capable, more noble. And that the other group, the dominated group, is less intelligent, less deserving, and it's lazy and inferior and all these other verbal terms that then are incorporated at the institutional level. It gets embedded into our institutions. So for Aaliyah, it was very salient to ask questions about who was valued in our college institution. When it came to articles, you know, she was an Africana Studies major, and so on one level you'd say, oh, this is wonderful. Her race is reflected. But when it came to her classes, her socioeconomic class was very much not reflected. And that caused so much pain for her because in spaces where she thought, well, at least here I should be visible, she felt so very invisible. When it came to issues around disability, because of her mother's experiences, that was incredibly painful. So even the places that she thought in an institution that wasn't necessarily supportive, the spaces that she thought would be, she didn't find it to be that way in many ways. And so how did we keep that in mind? How did we keep the oppression in mind? But also, I asked questions about her privileges. So what did it mean that she was in an elite institution having these questions, having these conversations, having these experiences? What values of privilege may she have internalized that also impact how she continues to relate to her family members? And finding this very important for us to talk about. And so some of the questions I asked were, where were the spaces that she felt power to act, but also where were the spaces that she didn't? And for her, she felt more able to act when it came to kind of organizing against police brutality, and she felt like she had so much less space to act in her family. And so then it was about what are the ways in which she could have smaller, maybe not macro system change in her family, but could she make smaller changes and feel a little bit more empowered in her family while maintaining the relationships that she valued. I asked her, and I was able to use the language of oppression and privilege because I also did some education, and this is my part. I was also trained via CBT, and so do feel a little comfortable in the therapeutic space through doing some education. So I used this language of oppression and privilege and asked her what her thoughts were and give her some of my thoughts, and then asked her how did they operate in her life. I also wanted to always keep the trauma salient, even if it wasn't the focus of conversation. And so asking questions about what would help her feel safer in the multiple spaces she accessed. What were her support systems? What were the additional resources she needed? I also labeled things. So she would give examples, and I'd say that sounds like a microaggression. And I remember one time she was like, yes, that's what it was. That was his feeling. And it's not that she didn't know it was a microaggression. She just hadn't used that word. And I think part of her was concerned about what it would mean if she used that word with me. And this is also when thinking about power in the room. She used a microaggression. She used an example of a microaggression as it related to another colleague of mine that she knew I had a relationship with. And I think she was concerned about whether I would use my power to just defend my colleague and defend the, her intent, or whether I could sit with her, Aaliyah, with her experience of it. I also did name things like it sounds like you attained privilege because of. And I would put things out there, I would name them, and then say, how did that sound with me asking you that question? And why do you, I would say, why do you think I asked about your privilege? Why do you think I asked about the way the institution may have impacted you? Why am I doing this? And gave her space to think through why? Why would this have an impact? And then what were her thoughts about salient events? So current events were always a part of our conversation. We weren't in a microcosm. And so part of what I did was have her, in the beginning of every session, identify the areas of focus. I did make suggestions. I wasn't a passive recipient, but I did want her to be able to feel like she could guide conversations. And sometimes I would say, well, you know, last week you said you wanted to talk more about your mother and your relationship with her, but now you want to go to a different topic area. How conscious of you are you as to why you're making that shift? Is it because it's easier or harder? And at the end of the day, of course, we're going to talk about what you want to talk about, but I want you to be as conscious as possible as to why you want to talk about this and not that. And so the other thing about integrating oppression, privilege, and in our work in intersectionality is I'm not forgetting about other tools that I have, and I'm not utilizing them. It's just the framework that I utilize them with are different. So I taught her emotional regulation skills, but it wasn't just about trauma and feeling triggered or feeling disconnected around the sexual assault. We had discussions about how she could utilize emotion regulation skills in classrooms, in organizing work. And when were the times where she didn't want to use emotion regulation skills, when she just wanted to be purely authentic and honest with her experiences because of the ways in which she felt that as a Black woman, especially of her feelings, a Black multiracial woman, her feelings of anger were consistently policed. And so we had conversations about how emotion regulation wasn't about policing emotions, but allowing her to have more choice and connection to the emotions she was experiencing and what she wanted to do with them. Assessing the multicultural family systems and the intergenerational trauma was via genograms. And so we started off in the beginning, first session, making a genogram and would have it always at the table, even as we were talking about her activism, because her grandmother on her mother's side actually also engaged in some activism, which helped her connect more to this other resource and source. I also taught her mindfulness and grounding skills, specifically for her trauma and anxiety. And then we also engaged in art and expressive therapy. That was something that she brought to the table. She very much also identified as an artist. And I remember that one of her homework was using her artistic skills for her to create the world that she wanted to see, and then to place herself in it, and to place herself in it by identifying the specific skills and, skills and strengths that she had and ways in which she wanted to change the world to make it that world. So she's very much connected to dance and to children and to art. and so saw some of her organizing and activism via those lenses, and she brought in her kind of her representation of that. I felt that it helped add another dimension of who she was and her power to our conversation. We also talked about the pros and cons of activism, the systems she wanted to change, the helplessness that she often felt in the face of those systems, and also had her identify her multiple identities. I integrated trauma-informed approaches and asked specific questions about her experiences. And so, yes, very much me as a therapist was a part of this conversation, and I saw earlier that someone asking a question about using the addressing model for itself as therapist, and I completely believe that that's necessary. So some of the work and training that I do in my own counseling center is that we talk about our social identities, and we identify our particular identities across those different lenses, but we also do an activity where we name what are the identities that are most salient to us as individuals and clinicians, what are the identities that make us the most uncomfortable to talk about, and what are the identities that we don't think about. And then we talk through how that impacts our clinical work. So if I don't even think about disability, then how am I going to bring that into the room in a salient way? If I'm uncomfortable talking about socioeconomic class, then what am I missing in my relationship with the client? So I very much recommend doing addressing work on your own, but also going down to something that's in another slide. It's also this question of disclosure. What identities are you disclosing and why to the people that you're working with, and what are the ones you're not? So I did ask myself what were the areas that made me uncomfortable to talk about with her. And oftentimes it was the ways in which systems of welfare were impacting her family, because I felt so helpless in the face of that. It was hard to talk about fighting the welfare system and our health system. What were the areas I consistently checked in on? I was very attuned to race and gender, but what was I missing? And some of that was her spiritual practice. What was my own participation in oppression and my accompanying biases and values? I am an administrator that works for a college campus, and so what does it mean when I have somebody who's not just indicting broader systems, but is also indicting our very institution that I reflect in many ways? And how are my identities influencing my work and what I approach, and what I might emphasize and what I don't emphasize, what I disclose, what I don't? And so I think in closing, so I know we just have a few minutes, what I want to name is that I think when we're embracing the intersections of trauma, oppression, and agency when working with clients, we as therapists are functioning as change agents, not just on the individual, but also on the broader level. And so I do think that in order to encourage agency of clients, we need to continually and with intentionality explore our own attitudes, implicit and explicit biases across social identities. That's personal work, that's therapeutic work, that's speaking training, that can be taking undoing racism training, but that's really dedicating ourselves to our own work. It's asking questions and learning, but not expecting our clients or colleagues to do all the work and educating us, to take that on ourselves. It's recognizing the specific ways we all participate in systems of power, privilege, and oppression, and being able to name that and working on how we can feel comfortable actually discussing that. Of course, being aware of our own multiple and intersecting identities and that of our clients, and committing to putting our awareness into different types of action. I actually talked with Aaliyah about the fact that I had access to some spaces that she didn't, and how she, and if she felt comfortable with me taking not just her concerns, but also with the concerns from some of the students of the Women of Cause support group to higher level administrators. And that was something I did in a very small change way. We need to notice who's in the room and not in the room at any given time. Exploring and naming the impact of privilege, oppression, and contextual factors, and ask about issues related to privilege and oppression with all people, not just people perceived as having oppressed identities. During a few weeks of the Black Lives Matter movement was especially big on college campuses, and there were a lot of things happening on our particular campus. We as a counseling center decided that we were going to ask every single student who came into therapy about the impact. We also did that for some of the terrorist attacks, and it actually brought up a wealth of information for us as clinicians, because even for students who you may not have thought based on their identities this was relevant to their lives, to definitively talk about how it's relevant. I also was able to talk to another student who said, well, this isn't actually very impactful in my life, but let me tell you about basically a terrorist attack that happened within my community that the news isn't covering. And so it opened up a wealth of conversation. And so also just things like exploring power dynamics with the room, naming and exploring structural challenges, and being willing to really name oppressive aspects, not just race, but racism. And also being aware that you might kind of have to prove yourself to clients, that you are able to explore social identities with them, and if they don't necessarily explore it with you right away, to not label them as difficult or non-compliant. And I'm going to, since we're kind of out of time, I just want to also, you have this in the slides about conversations with clients about power, oppression, and trauma, and just reiterating, validating experiences, using a layered approach, always checking in about shame and embarrassment. These conversations are so layered, but also be very there with the client, be there with yourself. So part of the reason that it can be really difficult for clinicians to talk about these areas are for multiple reasons. It's your own self as a clinician, your own trauma histories, intersectional identities, beliefs, but also that idea of potentially feeling helpless in the face of structural oppression. So what do we do with those feelings of helplessness? Also, sometimes we have limited training, supervision, and support. And the big one that comes up in a lot of conversations I've had with people is fear of harming clients. If I bring this up, won't this be harmful? Where oftentimes, I'm not saying that it can't be, and that's why we have to practice ways of bringing it up, but if this is already impacting the client, then these systems of oppression are harming them. And you naming that this is happening isn't necessarily going to cause harm. I very much liken it to suicide and asking about suicide and how scary it was for most of us, I would say, to ask about suicide that first time, because we feared that if we asked it, we would produce it in people. But that's not the case. If someone's not experiencing it, they'll just let you know. But if they are, how relieving and how powerful it can be for you to ask that question. And that's how I think of a lot of oppressive experiences, that for some people it can be so relieving and scary, but so relieving to have somebody say, this might be part of your lived experience, and you don't have to feel shame for that. So, thank you. And Q&A.
Thank you so much. That was great. We have a few questions that came in. The first one is, can you recommend any literature that could explain specifically understanding organizing intersectionality and discerning between what is real mental health issues and what is learned behavior as a result of intersectionality?
Wow, that is a great question, and unfortunately, I haven't found literature doing that. So the way in which that I've addressed that is by consultation with my colleagues, because it's also named my own bias, so I tend to think of organizing as great, but that it's not necessarily that. And so I've used particular cases with my clients, with my colleagues, to talk through, like, what am I missing? Could this be more mental health, more organizing? Is it both at the same time, which is definitively what I found. It's the Dr. Heal Thyself. I will look through to see if I have any specific articles, but it's definitely been more consultation.
Awesome. Thank you so much. The other question that we have that came in is, how do you address issues of power, race, oppression, and intersectionality as a white clinician working with a woman of color?
Okay, so first, I go back to doing your own work about what your identities mean, because you, as a white woman, I'm also sure you have the other identities there. So do your own work, but and mean. So depending on the client, depending on their presenting concern, I would still talk through self as therapist. So I'm sitting in front of you as a white woman, here to help you along X, Y, and Z issues. this may or may not be salient for you. This may or may not be something that we want to discuss, but I want to put it at the I want to put it out on the table. So my bias is towards transparency. So I do this with clients even around ethnicity. I'm Nigerian, and so that can be helpful but not helpful for other Nigerian clients. And so by putting it out there, we can have that conversation. And if that's not even a thing, then I move on, but I also say, but if it ever becomes a thing, know that we can talk about this. So I would encourage transparency and not necessarily making it a salient aspect if it's not that for the person, but putting it out there in the way that we put out other aspects of ourselves. But I would also really, really encourage collaboration and consultation. I think is wonderful, and there are a lot of groups out there across a lot of identities where people can kind of talk through with people who hold shared identities or explanations how to incorporate this into their work with specific clients and with specific presenting issues. And there's a lot of literature. I think there's more and more literature out there. I think one I want to point to is by D. Watts Jones, 2010, and it's called Vocation of Self, Opening the Door to Dialogue on Intersectionality in the Therapy Process. And I think that can help with that question, too. D, and last name is Watts Jones.
Thank you so much. So I just want to take the opportunity to thank you, Dr. Obasaju, for such a great presentation, and thank everyone for their participation. And we do want to just run through a few things before we end. So again, for those of you that are interested in obtaining continuing education credit for this webinar, please follow the steps that we have here. Information will be sent out to you. So you need to create a username and password at the NYU Silver CE online portal. You need to log on. You need to register for this particular webinar. And you need to submit your billing information for the $15 processing fee. Once you've done that, after 24 hours, you can log back in and you can take the assessment. Once you complete the assessment, a certificate will be produced for you. And you can, of course, look at the chat for detailed instructions and email silver at silver.continueducation@nyu.edu for any information in those regards. For next time, as part of 0 Degrees of Separation, the role of the social determinants, we will have a presentation on July 8th from 1 to 2 p.m. on promoting nutrition education in diverse populations. So we hope that all of you can join us for that to continue our series. And we are also doing a series on gender inequality, which this webinar serves both purposes. So we hope that you saw in the chat the information for both of those and you can access that information at a later time. So again, thank you so much, Dr. Obasaju. We really appreciated this presentation. And thank you, everyone, for participating today. Take care.